So how many of you took a stroll through the collection before you came in here tonight? I did. And you may have noticed something new. There's an object that is sitting next to the Donald Judd stack in our 1940s to Now gallery entitled Big Blue Pink by Judy Chicago. It's on loan from the personal collection of Judy Chicago thanks to the help of her gallerist Salon 94. So that's a very exciting opportunity. We'll be talking about it tonight. And I can't wait for you to see it if you haven't seen it yet. Judy Chicago, artist, author, educator. Her work and life are models for an enlarged definition of art, an expanded role for the artist, and women's rights to freedom of expression. In the early 1970s, Chicago pioneered feminist art and art education through a unique program at California State University, Fresno. She has continued to develop this pedagogical approach at institutions around America. In 1974, Judy turned her attention to the subject of women's history to create her most well-known work, The Dinner Party, a monumental, multimedia symbolic history of women in Western civilization. In 2007, The Dinner Party was permanently housed at the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. And if you haven't seen it, next time in New York, make the trek. Over the subsequent decades, Chicago turned her attention to a variety of subjects in a wide array of media, and we'll be covering those this evening, including The Birth Project, Power Play, The Holocaust Project From Darkness into Light, and Resolutions, A Stitch in Time. Since 2003, she's been working in an array of glass techniques. In 2011 and 12, Chicago's important contributions to Southern California art were highlighted in Pacific Standard Time, a Getty-funded initiative documenting and celebrating the region's rich history. In 2014, Coast to Coast exhibitions and events celebrated Chicago's 75th birthday, if you can believe it, which culminated in the complex pyrotechnic work, A Butterfly for Brooklyn. Over 12,000 people attended this pyro display in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. 2015 and 2016 brought the inclusion of Chicago's work in multiple museum exhibitions across the United States and Europe, including the brilliantly titled, Why Not Judy Chicago? An overview of her career that toured in Bilbao, Spain and Bordeaux, France. In the upcoming months, Salon 94 will feature her work in Frieze Masters in London and Art Basel, Miami Beach. For more than 5 decades, Judy Chicago has remained steadfast in her commitment to the power of art as a vehicle for intellectual transformation and social change, and to women's rights to engage the highest levels of art production. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the introduction you need to welcome Judy Chicago. So, Judy, I'm so glad you're finally here. Today we're going to be doing a bit of a tromp through your vaunted career. I think some people will be surprised by what they'll see, and probably know more than where we will start. People in the audience may be familiar with your work, especially your figurative work as it intersects with ideas of femininity, the human body. But some may be surprised to learn that early in your career, you're a bit of a minimalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was saying in the members' meet and greet that for a very long time, The Dinner Party blocked out the rest of my body of work. I've made a lot of art, as you said. And happily, I used to joke, I hope I'll live long enough to see the rest of my work emerge from the shadow of The Dinner Party. Even though I was very happy about all the attention it brought me, still it blocked out what is a big body of work. And with Pacific Standard Time, the 2011 and 2012 initiative, Getty Initiative in Southern California, which involved every institution, art institution from San Diego to Santa Barbara. Actually, this is funny because anyway, it kind of opened up a whole new space. And since then, I've been having all these shows across my career, which is great. But the thing about Pacific Standard Time that I was going to say is that when I was working in Southern California in the 60s, of course, which was a very inhospitable community for women, I was the only woman artist who was taken seriously. okay? And I had a real battle. Okay, so go fast forward to Pacific Standard Time, by which time things had changed, and no young curator would have had a show without some women, okay? So guess what? I was the only woman. So I was in like 8 museum shows, and I had 3 solo shows, and it was like what goes around comes around.
That's right. And in fact, there's been renewed attention on this early body of work,
Yes.
in fact. And I wonder if you might say a word about Rainbow Picket, because this work was in your first solo gallery show, which was at Ralph Nelson Gallery
right.
in LA in 1966. And then it was included in that foundational show of minimalist art entitled Primary Structures
right.
at the Jewish Museum in the
Yeah.
same year. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about this work and where it comes from. How does this show us early Judy Chicago?
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is that, you know, first of all, I got my master's in both painting and sculpture.
Right.
So I've gone back and forth in my career between 2 and 3 dimension. And for me, like some of my best work is where there's a fusion between them, like Rainbow Picket. Now, there's another side to Rainbow Picket, other than the story you just told about how it was in the Primary Structure show. There were, I think, 4 women in that show. There were like 72 artists. And I was a really young, idealistic artist, young woman. I mean, I didn't know you were supposed to get on the plane and go to New York when you were in a big New York major show. I mean, all I knew was that Rainbow Picket broke my heart. Because I was working in Pasadena in a big studio, which I shared with 2 other artists, and there was the most powerful curator in Southern California was named Walter Hopps.
Yeah.
And Walter there were a lot of artists in Pasadena at that time. Like Bruce Nauman was around the corner. I got Mark DeSuvero's studio next door. There was a lot of back and forth between New York and LA in terms of artists. Rolf brought a lot of New York artists. And Walter used to go to all the studios in Pasadena because he worked at the Pasadena Art Museum, and he'd come to our studio. And when I finished Rainbow Picket, Walter refused to look at it.
Why is that?
Well, I didn't know why he wouldn't look at it. All I knew was that it was like, I was like, oh my, I just wept. I had no idea why he wouldn't look at it. So years later, and I wrote about it in my first book, Through the Flower, but I didn't mention him. And years later, I had breakfast with Walter when he was at the Corcoran, and he said to me, Judy, I know you hated me. And he said, but you have to understand. He said, at that time in LA, women were only groupies or artists' wives. So what was I supposed to do when confronted with your work, which was stronger than a lot of the men's? It was like watching a woman pull up her skirt and roll down her stockings. I had to avert my eyes. And he actually expected me to say, oh, Walter, I really understand. I know, it was so hard for you, I'm sorry. But you know, I wanted to be taken seriously in the Southern California art scene. I always thought big. I mean, I always thought big.
And worked hard,
and
too.
worked, oh my God, I used to work 60 hours a week in my studio.
Yeah.
And in fact, I remember when I turned 40, I visited an artist friend of mine, a muralist named Judy Baca, and she said, I have to take Saturday and Sunday off. I have to. And I said, what on earth do you do? Now I know that now I'm an old lady, darling, I have to take time off, but I didn't know that. But anyway, so I was making this really big work, and I was going back and forth from painting. I mean, it's hard to get into my mindset at that time. I had already experienced, when I was in graduate school, the fact that my sort of natural, biomorphic, more organic, more gendered form was completely unacceptable in the LA art scene. I mean, my painting instructors just hated my early work.
And your approach to color, too.
And, they hated my color.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they hated my color. And because the whole art department was like enthralled with like burnt umbers and yellow ochres and olive greens, and here am I with cream and turquoise and pink, especially pink. So, you know, I had backed away because I would never have gotten my master's. I'd never gotten my master's degree with that work. So I kind of backed away from my own content and began to work with much more minimal form. Now, I'm not sorry about it because I really learned a lot formally during this work, and Rainbow Pink came out of that, like
It did.
simple form.
And in the reviews of this exhibition in 1966, Clement Greenberg, who is no feminist, by the way, one of the most vaunted art historians, quoted relentlessly in art history, said that this work was one of the strongest works in the show.
Yeah, but Peter Plagens, you know, I didn't know what Clement Greenberg said because I was in Southern California, and Peter Plagens wrote in Art Forum, which I just think is incredible, this work just doesn't have the guns.
So that speaks to the general climate
Right.
of machismo that definitely dominated in Southern California at this time and in the art world more generally. But you've talked about the ways in which you co-opted certain strategies of that machismo to your own ends. And I see it in works like this.
Oh, the
1964 car hood.
When
Could you talk a little bit about this work?
Well, I was telling you today when we were walking around the museum that John Chamberlain was around a lot then. He was living in Southern California, and I used to hang out with him. And he used to say, it was auto body school, I should go to auto body school, those guys really know how to paint. Because I think he used to use spray cans, actually,
He
on
did.
those cars.
So John
right.
Chamberlain, you may be familiar with in our collection, sort of an abstract sculptor who used crushed car parts.
Right.
His Swannanoa one is in our collection, and this is a brand new fact to me. I had no idea that you and John Chamberlain were.
Hung out, yeah, I like John. I mean, actually, for a lot of those guys, it was conflictful for them because I think they saw that I was a serious young artist, but I was like not in the right body for their mindset. So, but anyway, so John never went to auto body school, but when I got out of graduate school, I went to auto body school, me and 250 guys. And they made me wear this white long shop coat because God forbid I should bend over when I'm spraying, and one of them saw a titty, which of course they'd never seen before, right? But I was also telling you, I really learned a lot. I mean, you know, even though this was a really difficult period, I mean, really was difficult, I was like fighting for a place in the art world. Nonetheless, I learned a lot at auto body school. I learned about a respect for craft. I learned how to tape properly. Nobody ever thinks about that. My paint teacher was named Percy Jeffries. He was a show car painter, and he drove this luscious lavender candy apple convertible. I mean, so, you know, I was learning about a whole different kind of aesthetic. And I mean, from the beginning, I got interested in fringe techniques, you know, and nobody ever commented on that. In my early work, you know, it was when I brought women's fringe techniques into the mainstream that people talked about it. But I had always been interested in fringe techniques, plastics, auto body techniques. One of the things I liked in auto body school was being able to fuse color and surface. I learned how to do that. You know, and I've sprayed everything now. I've sprayed automotive lacquer, I've sprayed fabric paint, I've sprayed China paint, I've sprayed glass paint, I've sprayed acrylic. I mean, I've just
You've used it in every phase of your career.
Yes, I've used it in every phase of my career.
And moving outward from that experience, you expanded outward into a different kind of painting practice. This example is on display in the gallery here at Crystal Bridges. This is Big Blue Pink from the Flesh Garden series. It comes directly out of that new form of technique that you learned, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. But by this time, okay, so now I've had like a decade of struggling in the LA art scene, and, you know, being told continually that I couldn't be a woman and an artist too. I'm like, really? Now, how am I going to solve that? And, you know, I had pulled back from my own natural way of making forms and my own, and certainly my content. And of course, this was a period where content was not really discussed in art. You know, it was all about the edge. Like, like Sam Francis and I were friends. And actually, that's a really, not, Sam was very supportive of women artists. But he sponsored me. He had a print shop in Santa Monica. And he sponsored my first lithograph, which became the first image of menstruation in Western art. It's called Red Flag, okay? So he had a Japanese printmaker. Even I can't believe I did this. Anyway, so we're working as like a image of pulling a tampon out. Now, the thing that's amazing is that it taught me about the impact of the absence of images. Because when I first showed this image, some woman got up and started screaming at me about how could I show an image of a bloody penis. I mean, she didn't.
She misread the image.
She didn't even recognize what women do every month.
Yeah.
Because there were no images. Okay. But anyway, so I'm working on this with this Japanese printmaker who doesn't speak that much English. And so we're like, when you work in a print shop, you often put the work up and you talk to the printer about, okay, and he had taught me about a rainbow roll, you know, how you go from 2 colors or more on one roller. And so we're standing there looking at it, and I say, well, what do you think of it? Now, he's Japanese, and he's looking at a menstruation image, right? And he's like, me printer, you artist. I asked him. I mean, he must have been like mortified.
I think that was a very understandable approach, right?
Okay.
I mean, he gave you artistic license. That's a good printer,
Yes.
right?
Okay, so I was actually, that was like the same time as I did this painting. All right, so what I was trying to do at this point, I was in Fresno. I was giving my students permission to do something I had not been able to do when I was young, which was to make art out of my own experience as a woman. I had to like move away from that. I was trying to figure out how to reconnect and bring this language that I had built in the first decade of my career together with content that, like Red Flag, you know, like, or women's experiences. I was trying to figure out how to do it. And I was also trying to open my practice. So I was living in this small town in what's called the Navel of California. Actually, it's called, there's a Yiddish expression for navel, it's called pupik. And there's often called the Pupik of California.
Charming.
Yeah, terrible. Anyway, so I went away from LA in order to do this. I couldn't do I couldn't create a feminist art practice or feminist art education in Los Angeles.
That's
it
right.
was too too much pressure. So, but the one thing about Southern California that's really important to understand is, as macho it was and all that, is there was a spirit of self-invention there. This was way before the advent of the international art market. There was no international, there was no market. Nobody ever thought they'd make money as an artist. The idea was to be taken seriously as an artist and also to invent yourself. You know, I mean, everybody asks me about my name change. I mean, all the artists in LA had underground names at that time.
They had alter egos.
Right. Ed Ruscha was Eddie Ruscha. Larry Bell was Ben Lux. I was Judy Chicago. If you knew, my first dealer named me that because of my Chicago accent. So there was this whole spirit of self-invention. I mean, when you think about it, you know, where would I get the idea that I could create a new kind of art practice or a new kind of art education? It came out of that spirit of self-invention in Southern California. So in this painting, and these are really large paintings if you go up and see it, I was trying to expand outward, you know, in images of a kind of merger of flesh and landscape, because I was living in the middle of, you know, California, beautiful landscape, beautiful. And it really interested me that when this painting was at the Getty in Pacific Standard Time, one of the curators told me that a lot of my male colleagues complained to him about the inclusion of this painting, the color, the softness. You know, even though I had really moved away from any gender markings in my work, it kept like filtering in. But at this point, I had had enough, and I'm like, I'm going to be myself as an artist. That's it. I'm going to be myself. And you know, now I realize it was like I was about to make a really big radical change in my image making.
That's right, and you did. As the 70s were on, you were integral in the introduction of feminist art education, and starting in California, but then of course eventually expanding outward. And that pedagogical approach, I wonder if you might reflect on that a bit as it pertains to your thoughts around the monumental work, The Dinner Party. Because the geometric, the abstract still is present here, and yet this feels like a radical return to image making.
Yeah,
you've left behind the need to conform to any sort of masculinist ideal of what art can be. This is a new vocabulary.
Yes, absolutely. And I set out. I mean, it took me a number of years to construct a new vocabulary. You know, I started really at the end of the 60s when I started doing my research into women's history at a time when there were no women's studies classes, and the idea was that women had no history. And but my father was a real student of history, and you know, I was facing so many challenges as a young artist, and I just started to wonder if there had ever been any women before me who had overcome the kind of challenges, faced and overcome the challenges, and how had they done it? And so first I started reading and studying and looking, and then I started working on my imagery really consciously. I had also already been working on color. You know, I did this whole color book that the Getty Research Institute has now, trying to figure out how color could be a motive. And the only parallel I've ever seen to what I did in terms of color, which was very different from Albers, which was a much more intellectual approach. I was interested in emotive states, is when I did the book on Frida Kahlo with the art historian, the British art historian Frances Borzello. In one of her journals, I found a page of color where she equated color with emotions. And that is the only analog I've ever seen. But anyway, so I had already begun to build my color vocabulary, and I met somebody last night from South Dakota, and I get South and North Dakota mixed up. But the reason it's important is that in the early 70s, I was lecturing a lot, and I was in, I think, North Dakota, and I was at this point making images. I was making sprayed images on canvas called The Great Ladies, where I was trying to build imagery representing the different women I was studying in history. And so I was talking about these images in this lecture, and there were like 200 people there, and at the end of the lecture, I said, well, do you understand these images? Would you understand these images? And people said, it was really interesting. They said, well, you know, what you're telling us is very interesting, but if we saw the work without you telling us, we really wouldn't understand your intention. Well, so I'm like, okay, so then I started working on opening my imagery, making it more accessible, particularly once I decided with the hubris of youth that I, with my paintbrush, was going to tell the history of women in Western civilization. So, and I looked at that point, I looked back to the Middle Ages because, you know, they taught an illiterate population about Christianity through art.
Through didactic pictures.
Right,
Right.
okay, and beautiful pictures. And so I wanted, I mean, we had and still have a sort of illiterate population in terms of women's history. It's still not incorporated in the curriculum of, you know, our schools.
That's right.
And so, and if it is, it's over there, you know, like everybody doesn't have to take it. Why should everybody have to learn women's history when we can all learn men's history instead? So I wanted to reach a big audience. Okay, now, you know, thinking back about this, of course, you're talking about Clement Greenberg and modernism and like, I mean, all of this was anathema, absolutely anathema to
Oh, certainly. You don't talk about gender. You don't talk about any emotional state. You don't, none of that.
and you don't communicate to a
wide
large
population.
audience.
Certainly
No,
not.
right?
Why would you?
Oh my God,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Why should, you know, why should there be a museum in Arkansas?
Precisely.
I mean, we were talking about it today. What a wonderful model Alice Walton is providing for people with the means to create museums.
That's right.
So, you know, I also started studying China painting. And the most amazing thing happened also last night. Last night, the National Museum of Women in the Arts Arkansas Committee, which was one of the oldest committees, gave a reception. And one of the women told me that her mother was a China painter, and she was at the China painting show in New Orleans, where I went as part of my apprenticeship in 1972,
Get out.
which figures in the film right out of history, the making. What I remember is how hot it was. It was July. Oh, God. But was that amazing? Anyway, so, you know, I was studying China painting. So it took years, you know, and so it all came together.
That's
in the
right.
dinner
And
party.
it came together both, I mean, you sort of self-admonishingly say, you know, at your own paintbrush, but in fact, this project was really one of the beginning points of a truly collaborative effort, because you worked with artisans of all stripes.
And a lot of people weren't artists. 'Cause
Yeah.
There was research, there was graphics, there was, you know, it crossed media, it crossed masculine and feminine areas, you know, like people always talk about the China painting and the needlework, but, you know, the structure of the dinner party, the floor, the parts of the floor, the way the pattern, I mean, all of that was designed in collaboration with an industrial designer, a
That's
guy
right.
named Ken Gilliam. You know, it's like funny because, you know, the men get erased from the dinner party. But I like Judy. And then also there's this idea, oh yeah, Judy worked with 400 women, not true. You know, like we all sat down and came up with the dinner party. Yeah, right, Anyway, in 2017, if you haven't seen the dinner party yet, 2017 is the 10-year anniversary of the Sackler Center. And there's going to be a year-long celebration of feminism all over the museum with exhibitions. And in October 2017, they're opening an exhibition called The Roots of the Dinner Party, which is going to look at the way in which, for example, I translated. It's going to have a lot of archival material that's never been seen before, like the way my notebooks where I was doing research and how I translated the historical information into images. There's just a lot, so it'll be interesting if you're interested in that, if you've never been to the Brooklyn Museum to see the dinner party, which by the way accounts for 20% of the traffic to the museum.
That's right. And it has an enormous impact. And I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but I taught at Brooklyn College earlier in my career. And one of the things I required my students to do was to go and visit the dinner party.
Oh, really? No, you never told
yes,
me that.
many of my students were first-generation college students. Many of them were the first in their family to speak English. And I had a student named Michelle. she chose to write her final paper on the dinner party, and I asked her if I could share just a piece of this because I think it's important before we leave this work. This is a person who had never been in a museum before in encountering your work. The dinner table on which the settings are placed is a representation of the historical and mythical women who have made contributions to society. The props are utilized in such a way to honor and elevate feminine achievement. Chicago dreamed of a world where women's history and contributions were fully recognized and accepted into society. The passion, history, pain, and triumph that emits from this work of art is truly worth the trip. Just by being in the same room as this artwork, you feel as though the ghosts of those women are present. You see their place settings, learn about their accomplishments, and realize the struggles they must have overcome to be invited to the party.
Now, why didn't she write for the yeah. I was going to say, why didn't she write for the New York Times instead of Hilton Kramer?
I wanted to share that with you because of the what you mentioned before, your opening up of your vocabulary to allow a wider audience in, to open the doors for generations of women artists and all artists to follow you. It still continues today.
Well, I want to say something about that, Chad, because actually, after I saw, now, you know, I was really ambitious. I had big dreams, you know, as a young artist. But the dinner party taught me about the power of art, which is way beyond what was way beyond my wildest dreams. I mean, like, there's a book by a historian named Jane Gerhardt called The Dinner Party, The Power of Popular Feminism, in which she traces like what happened with the grassroots tour of the dinner party and how the dinner party was impelled around the world by people who were just furious that their institutions would not show it. And I mean, did I ever dream that women in Germany would take over the Frankfurt Opera House and organize a festival of 1,000 women where women from all over came and dressed up as the women on the table and the floor? It was fabulous. I mean, people came up to each other and said, "Hello, I'm Sappho. Oh, how do you do? I'm Queen Elizabeth." I mean, it was really great. And then an all-female orchestra played a Fanny Mendelssohn piece that had never been performed. I mean, so my point is there was no going back from what I learned about the dinner party. I could not go back into the small elitist thinking of the art world.
And you didn't.
I couldn't.
The way that your career has progressed since then, you are a tireless maker and producer of images. And here I want to talk a little bit about your projects in the 80s. This is from the Birth Project. And this particular image is called Earth Birth. And I wonder if you might talk about the way that the dinner party then inflected your subsequent work.
Well, first of all, you have to realize that I lost everything as a result of the dinner party. I lost everything. You know, it was really confusing to me because like when the dinner party was in Boston, there's like these buses with my name on them and stuff like that. I mean, and here I am after the dinner party. I lost my staff, my studio, my marriage. I was in debt. The dinner party, and people thought I was rich because there were thousands of people were going to all these showings, but I never made any money. You know, museums don't pay artists to show except in Europe. And all I had was my burning passion to make art, and I knew that I wanted to work on the subject of birth because, again, there was an absence. You know, when Arrakis called the show that he did, this career narrative you were talking about, Bill, like, why not Judy Chicago? You know, he was kind of playing off this, like what I was talking about, like, why not? Why not any subjects of birth? Why not any knowledge about women's history? And I got interested in the subject of birth when I was doing the back of the Mary Wollstonecraft runner. The other thing that happened to me in the dinner party, which actually I've never really talked that much about, you know, I'm a classically trained artist. I started art school when I was 5. You know, I drew from the model, I drew from still lifes, I drew from animals, from anatomy. You know, I'm a classically trained artist. And so I had moved away from representation. And in the dinner party, actually mostly on the runner backs, I came back to representation. And when I was working on the Mary Wollstonecraft runner back, which depicts Mary Wollstonecraft dying from childbed fever 2 months after giving birth to her daughter Mary, who became Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. The runner is done in this really kitschy technique called stump work. And at that point, there was no knowledge of the amount of art there has been about the subject of birth. That only actually happened recently when Massimiliano Gianni did the show The Great Mother, and it turns out there's a huge amount of work on the subject of birth, but it has been left out of the
narrative
discourse.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and I actually learned something new about erasure. It's not just the erasure of women's production, it's also the erasure of content that has been outside the discourse or considered unimportant. Anyway, so the needlework transformed what was a really raw and graphic image. And so I thought, gee, I'm going to work on that subject.
And you did.
Well, what happened was when I said I had lost everything, the only thing I had other than knowing I wanted to work on this subject was as the dinner party traveled, I started getting all these letters from needleworkers who said, if you ever do another project, and I already knew I wanted to do this needlework, if you ever do another project, I would like to work on it, okay? So in 1981, when the second dinner party book was published, I was living in Northern California, and there was a publication party for the second book at the San Francisco Museum of Art, and I used it to, I invited all these needleworkers in the Bay Area to come to it, and a woman by then had also came from Houston, who had her name's Mary Russ Taylor. She's an Arkansas native. She's here.
She's here tonight. Yeah.
She organized the first grassroots showing of the dinner party in Houston, and she was interested in what I was doing next, and so she came to this event after the book of signing, and she watched me give out, at that time, this was 81, $700, that was a lot then, now it's not, $700 worth of fabrics, thread, and patterns to total strangers who had who wanted to work with me, and Mary Ross is like, ooh, I think you need some organization.
That was a good Mary Ross impression.
No, I didn't have enough of a Southern accent.
Yeah.
She has a great Southern accent. Okay, so I worked on the Birth Project from 1980 to 1985. I worked with 150 needleworkers around the country and as far away as New Zealand and Canada. We created 85 works, and Mary Ross organized an exhibition tour that went to 100 places. And I was having all this problem with the dinner party where no museums wanted to show it, so I didn't want to do that again. So I started out with the idea of just hanging these pieces on clotheslines like needleworkers do with quilts. The problem is I'm an artist, and pretty soon, there's months and months of painting and needlework on these images, and I'm like, ooh, I guess I can't put them on quilts. So anyhow, the Birth Project was shown in all different venues, everything from Planned Parenthoods to museums. It was great. And now a lot of the work is permanently placed in museums around the country.
That's right. And this attention to imagery and particularly expressiveness of the human body continues throughout the 80s and into the 90s. In your series, Power Play, this particularly comes into focus. I wonder if you might touch on that a bit.
Well, again, by the early 1980s, I was deep in the birth project. Mary Ross and I had a building in Northern California that was filled with the birth project work. And I went to Europe and saw the great Renaissance paintings, which of course I had studied but never seen. And I'm like, whoa, if modern society was born in the Renaissance, so was our concept of the heroic. And by that time, I'd been working for 15 years on issues of female identity, like who are we, okay, experientially, philosophically, metaphysically, what does it mean to be female? And I thought, well, you know, gender is not exclusively female, although if you went to the library in the early 80s and you looked up gender, that's all that appeared were books on women. It was before gender studies, before queer theory, and I thought to myself, you know, I'm really interested in examining the gender construct of masculinity, which I'm going to do in a series of images that rival the Renaissance paintings in scale. So like this is 9 feet by 12 feet. And it also is modeled on the way Renaissance paintings were done in a modernist framework, so that there's, first I developed a specific primer that was transparent because I wanted to work on Belgian linen, but
you can see that too.
Right, but I wanted, again, surface and color to fuse, and then I underpainted with spray paint and overpainted with oil paint.
So fusing this, the history of your techniques that you had picked up along the way.
Right, and the other thing I did is I started working for the male model. This was actually really interesting. By this time I was working, Mary Ross had I had this idea. I couldn't do this new work in the Birth Project studio. It was too filled with Birth Project work. So I thought, oh, I'd just go around the country and Donald, when we got married, I operated on rent paint store. I didn't own any property. I didn't want to own any property. So Donald was like, well, we have to have a place of our own. Oh my God. Anyway, so I thought, okay, I'll just go rent places around the country that I like and I'll paint. Mary Ross said, well, I have this house in Santa Fe that, you know, is empty. I can't be an absentee landlady. It isn't working. Why don't you go paint there? So it's a typical New Mexico story. First I went for 3 weeks, then I went for 3 months. Then I was living there, but all my stuff was in California, and I always thought I'd go back to California. Anyhow, I started working from a male model. Now you have to understand that when I was in art school, you never had a male nude. It was like a complete taboo. They had to be closed, okay? God forbid you should see an erection. Anyway, but I had to go through a certain psychological struggle to be able to make these images because, you know, we go to the museums all the time, we see men's images of women.
That's right.
And, you know, but you have to feel confident enough to be able to make a man's body however you want it, render it however you want it, you know, and I had to develop the psychological strength to be able to do that.
To own the authorship,
yes.
The agency.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Of the painted
Yes,
act.
and you know, one of the things I was interested in was exploring what the male body could be, how to use it expressively, all the ways. You know, when I was looking at those palette paintings of that person I didn't know.
Joseph Decker, who is in our historic galleries.
Well,
yes.
Donald, you know, says, go look at those because they're really a lot like the images of the male heads I did, of these screaming male heads. And, you know, anyway, so I did a huge series of images, paintings, weavings, drawings, bronzes, and cast paper pieces called Power Play. And I sent you the essay by Jonathan Katz because there was a recent showing of Power Play that starts out, Judy Chicago has lousy timing, because he talked about how Power Play appeared before there was a context. But, you know, that's true of a lot of my work. You know, that there was no...
You're very prescient, that's right.
Right, you know, the contexts have developed after my work.
There was no vocabulary even to talk about
Right.
some of the issues that you were exploring through color, form, shape, space.
Yes.
And I think that's followed your trajectory throughout your career. And in fact, I think if we move forward a bit, you'll see that your career also admirably, in my view, touches on history in really important and foundational ways. This project, the Holocaust Project, From Darkness into Night, which integrates, like many of your projects, across media.
Yeah, well, in 1985, I met Donald 7 times between 1984 and 1985, and nobody could believe it. They're like, what are you, blind? I have a very handsome husband, if you notice. Anyway, but I wasn't looking, so then, you know, I just finally looked, and I'm like, woo. Anyway, we met. I was just getting interested in the subject of the Holocaust. It makes sense if we're both from secular Jewish families. We came up at a time when there were no Holocaust studies in school. Neither of us knew anything about the Holocaust. I was just emerging from my study of power gone amok. And, you know, God knows the Holocaust was power gone amok, or as Virginia Woolf called it, patriarchy gone mad. And I suddenly realized I didn't know a thing about this. And Shoah was about to open in New York, the 9-hour film by Claude Lanzmann. And, you know, Donald and I just like men. I'm like, I want to go to New York and see Shoah. Do you want to go? He's like, oh, yeah, okay. So we get on the plane. We have no idea what we go. We sit in this theater for a weekend looking at this film, which made us feel like we were idiots. We knew nothing, so ignorant about the Jewish history, our history, ignorant about the Holocaust. And so we're like, okay, we got married. We started working on the Holocaust Project together. I mean, but you know, the way, for me, making art is a process of discovery. And, you know, you start down a path and you go where the path takes you. And so it took Donald and me on an 8-year journey.
And a journey of collaboration and discovery through the research process and learning together, yeah?
And so, like, this combines painting and photography. It's the smallest image in the series, and it is based on a photograph that Donald took. We traveled for 2 months in 1987. From 85 to 87, we researched. And then in 1987, we made a trip through the landscape of the Holocaust. Germany, France, Austria, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia. Did I forget anything? Anyway, it was 2.5 months of massacre sites, concentration camps. I still don't know how we did it. Maybe because what we were learning was so riveting. We started out thinking we would deal with the Jewish experience of the Holocaust, which is how the Holocaust is presented in American institutions. But as we traveled around to all these other countries, we realized that the Holocaust was much vaster, impacted many more people, and had many more implications for the future than we had ever imagined. And so slowly our concept and our view changed. And this is the last work in the Holocaust Project. This is the center panel of an image called Rainbow Shabbat, a vision for the future, which recasts the Friday night Jewish Sabbath dinner as a metaphor for global healing and sharing. And this is actually when I started working in glass.
And this moment too, I mean, you have constantly surprised and challenged the art world, and I think the sort of the art world elite by shifting your focus and learning new techniques and trying something new.
Oh, what a thought.
Even as you have a kind of fidelity to the history of your own imagery in your career. So, here again is the imagery of a table around which people gather. Here again is the repetition of the rainbow form, right? Which we saw in the very first work that we looked at today, Rainbow Picket. And so if you only open your eyes, you can see that there's a long trajectory to your work, and to allow you to express and try something new, the dynamism of your career has always been a challenge and an inspiration, I think. And it's no more better expressed, I think, than in this series. You started here, as you mentioned, working in glass, and I'd like to skip ahead to this series.
Yeah, okay, fine. So this is very recent, actually. We just went through my last collaborative project, which was called Resolutions, A Stitch in Time. And I was interested in two things. I was interested in making images for the future, recasting the future in terms of what kind of future we can have. It comes right out of Rainbow Shabbat.
Yep.
What does it really mean to have a global, diverse future? How far we are from that, my goodness.
Right.
And
those themes carry forward into your recent work in glass.
yeah, this is a series called Heads Up, and it's glass. At a certain point, I began to bring back some of the other techniques I'd used, like porcelain and bronze, and combine them with glass. One of my favorite pieces is that one, the bronze in the back called, something head. Yeah, I know it's golden tongue. It's like male head with golden tongue, is that what it's called? Or grand head with golden tongue. I'm like, how many of us have not met that person in life?
We'll just continue forward.
And when I originally did Headcast, my first series was all hands. I got very interested in how a hand gesture can mean so many different things. And then I got interested in heads, and I cast this whole series of heads, and one of them just really interested me, the Toby heads. There was something about the shape of this woman's head. And this combines glass and bronze, which was technically very challenging and interesting, and it's sprayed.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And this whole exploration of glass, I mean, when I visited your studio, there's heads everywhere. You're
right.
still trying it out. You're still pushing the edges of this medium, which is still a challenge to you. Yeah, you still find
glass is incredibly challenging.
Right.
First of all, I was in Southern California I was talking about this at the meet and greet, during the period where some of the Southern California artists, actually California artists, Peter Voulkos and John Mason, were bringing ceramics over from its decorative and craft origins. And when I started working in glass, I mean, that's the same place we are with glass
That's right.
now.
Yep.
And it's just beginning to move out of its craft origins into the art world.
Yep.
And I've really found that fascinating. It's endlessly challenging. Glass is endlessly challenging.
and fun on that score too.
Well, fun, yeah. I mean, I'm finishing a series that has been really grueling that goes back to painting on glass. Because when I was studying China painting, a lot of the China painters also painted on glass in a technique that nobody knows in the glass world, where it's multiply fired, and it allows a level of detail that is just, and also fusion of color and surface, which, anyway, it's like challenging, difficult, exciting, thrilling discoveries.
And speaking of thrilling, challenging, exciting, as a coda to this long discussion of the arc of your career, I'd like to return to a very early work that has recently been, that you've revisited. And this is Purple Atmosphere from 1969. And I wonder if you might just say a word about your engagement
fireworks,
with...
yeah.
Yeah.
In the late 60s, people talk about my collaboration as if the dinner party was my first collaboration. I was always interested in collaboration. And I used to organize, when I was like in Pasadena, I organized artist events and I collaborated with other artists. And we did this, I think it was in 67. My studio in Pasadena fronted on Colorado Boulevard, which is where the Rose Parade goes. And, you know, thousands of people would come in the night before on New Year's Eve, which happens now to be my anniversary with Donald. Anyway, but thousands of people would come in and they'd set up shop and they'd have all these, like, they'd bring televisions and they'd bring, like, cookers and they'd come in starting the night before. And so some of my artist friends and I decided we would do, this is the origin of the fireworks.
Yeah.
We would do a street performance. So we blocked off a street on Raymond Avenue, which was perpendicular to Colorado, which was the corner where my studio was. And we did all these performances, and we stretched screens across the building and the days of light shows and stuff like that. And there was a big Klieg light, and I had made this big color wheel. And I also lined the streets with fog machines. Mm-hmm. And so here's the color wheel, and here's the fog going up, and I see all this color in the sky. And it's like my color systems, like in Pasadena Lifesavers and stuff, free in the air. And I'm like, I'm going to do fireworks. I'm going to do colored smokes. Now, these were the days when I and my friends could just go out on the beach in the national forest and just do what you wanted. Yeah. So I did these smoke pieces all over Southern California. Mm-hmm. And when you came in, you saw a video that Jeannie is helping make into a real video. I started combining painted women's bodies with colored smokes. And so that's going to be a video called Women in Smoke. Right. But it's the only time, let's go to the next one. So I did fireworks from 68 to 74. And in 74, I was invited to participate in a sculpture in the 60s show organized by the Oakland Museum. And it was the first time I tried to make an image with fireworks. And by this time, the butterfly, which had been a theme in my work early and I had suppressed, was coming back. So I decided to make this big butterfly. It lasted for 17 minutes on the shore of Lake Merritt. Now, at this point, my fireworks are getting bigger and more expensive, and I was training to be a pyrotechnician.
You're an auto body worker, you're a pyrotechnician.
I'm a maniac.
Yes, you are. Maniac, Judy Chicago.
So, but this is the only time in my life, in my career, that I have ever had to give up something.
Well, you didn't give it up for good.
Well, no, but I was basically sexually harassed by a guy who I was apprenticing with, which was the only way to become a pyrotechnician then. There were no women pyrotechnicians. And I couldn't get enough support, financial support, to get bigger. So I stopped in 74. And then it wasn't until Pacific Standard Time, that I was asked to start again. They gave me the opportunity to pick up where I left off. So I did fireworks pieces as part of Pacific Standard Time. And then in 2014, for my 75th birthday, in conjunction with the Brooklyn Museum show of my early work, I did this big piece called A Butterfly for Brooklyn. I kind of picked up. And 12,000 people came to the show, came to see it. And at the end of it, all 12,000 people sang happy birthday to me. It was like, oh my God.
I think that's a fitting way to end our conversation here, and we'll. Thank you, Judy. We're going to open the floor to a couple of questions from the audience.
Okay, have your hand up high. Brady, you want to grab that question over there?
Yes.
Could you introduce yourself first before you ask the question? Stand up and introduce yourself so everybody can hear you. Good.
I haven't had time to get nervous yet. Yay. Hey, I'm Kat Wilson, and I'm amazed that I got to drive 2 minutes to see you talk tonight. That's amazing. Maybe slightly drunk even. I have a question as an artist to an artist. A lot of times singers talk about when they write a big hit song, like Eddie Vedder, for example, when he wrote I'm Still Alive or whatever it's called. He talks about when he wrote the lyrics, he thinks about the feeling he got when he wrote the lyrics to the song, and every time he performs it, he can feel that feeling. So I wonder, when you created in your mind the dinner party, if you still kind of get that feeling. And then I also wonder, do you feel like there were different parts in your life that came together for you to come up with such a brilliant idea? Thank you.
Well, making art's not like a song. I mean, a song you perform over and over again. A work of art you make, and then you move on. So, no, I can't relate to how it would be to perform the same song all the time, okay? It's just a completely different experience, because in a work of art, the work of art becomes the embodiment of whatever feelings and ideas you had. And, that's tangible. That's why I like to make art, because it's tangible. That's why I didn't do a lot of performance or video or anything, because, that's more like a song. So I can't, and I don't know how to answer the other question.
Well, I wonder if you might, to follow up there, Judy, when you go back to the dinner party, when you walk in the space of the Sackler Center, what psychologically, what kind of a state are you in?
Well, there were over the course of the years the dinner party's been there were two deputy directors at the Brooklyn Museum. The first one was Mark Mayer, who is now the director of the National Gallery in Ottawa, in Canada. And I would walk into the dinner party, and then I would walk into Mark's office and I would say, "The damn light is out over Theodora." I know it's not your job description, but could you please do something about it? Sorry.
So in answer to my
really
question,
you
the
asked me
psychological state is angry. Got it. Next question. Anybody, other questions?
Right over here.
Yep.
Pardon me.
Actually, Catherine Morris, the curator, she always worries when I come. She goes in there to check to make sure all the lights are on. She says, "I know it's going to burn out as soon as Judy walks in there."
Hi, my name's Austin. My question is, what has been some of the most important criticisms you've received as a fine artist through your career?
Everything you can imagine. I try not to dwell on it. When I was a young artist, there was another artist named Billy L. Bankston in Southern California who gave me the best piece of advice. He said, never read reviews. Just count the column inches and the number of pictures. And it says, if I read all the reviews of my work, I would have slit my throat.
You can take one more.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay, right over here. And probably the last one, so we have time for book signing.
Yep.
Okay, who are you?
My name is Elise Jones. I'm a retired art teacher. And so I was wondering, you've been given many, many questions in all of your career and everything. Is there a question that you wanted people to ask, but they never did?
No, but I'll tell you the stupidest question I was ever asked. The stupidest question I was ever asked had to do with the Birth Project. Some of the work is on needlepoint canvas, and somebody asked me how I got all the holes in the canvas. The implication being that I had a whole squad of slaves punching holes in needlepoint canvas. And I'm like, oh, it comes that way. Thank you all for coming.
Please,
I'll sign
yes,
your book.
please, Judy Chicago.